You may remember the historic moment when the B-29 superfortress dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forever altering the course of World War II. Or perhaps you've heard tales of the P-51 Mustang, the sleek, silver workhorse that escorted Allied bomber fleets deep into enemy territory, its engines roaring as it fended off swarms of hostile fighters with unmatched courage. Yet few people, even avid students of military history, know that over the storm-churned western Pacific skies in February 1945, a rescue mission more stirring, more improbable, and more deeply human than any lone hero legend unfolded. A damaged single-engine P-51 Mustang, its fuel tank barely half full and only enough for a one-way return trip to its base, dared to abandon its safe retreat. It turned back into the jaws of danger to drag a crippled B-29, its fuselage torn by enemy fire, two engines incinerated, and its interior choking with smoke, through 120 miles of deadly airspace, swarming with Japanese Zero fighters, defying 4 waves of relentless, coordinated assaults. This unlikely pair of aircraft and their crews forged a bond of trust and sacrifice that would carry 11 men from the brink of certain death to the safety of Allied waters. This forgotten Iwo Jima Skytog mission, buried for decades in the dusty archives of the Pacific Theater, had no massive fleet support, no ground radar guidance, and no guarantee of success. It relied solely on 2 strangers, pilots from vastly different backgrounds, united by a shared sense of duty and an unshakable commitment to never leave a comrade behind, who wrote one of war's most touching stories of brotherhood. Today, we follow the B-29's smoke-streaked flight path back to that fiery high-altitude battlefield, peeling back the layers of time to uncover the little-known details behind this seemingly impossible rescue. It is a tale of quiet defiance against orders, of quick thinking and wit triumphing over overwhelming odds, of ordinary men pushed to their limits and discovering reserves of courage they never knew they had, and of the extraordinary miracle of lives intertwined in the darkest hours of despair. To truly grasp the heroism and stakes of this mission, one must first understand the unique and volatile context of the Pacific War in early 1945. By this point in the conflict, the tide had turned firmly in favor of the Allies. U.S. forces had island-hopped their way across the Pacific, capturing key territories like Guadalcanal, Aspan, and Guam, and were now closing in on Japan's home islands. The next critical step was the invasion of Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island located roughly 660 miles south of Tokyo. Iwo Jima was more than just a strategic outpost. It was a vital refueling stop for B-29 bombers en route to Japan, and its capture would allow Allied forces to launch longer, more sustained bombing raids on Tokyo and other major Japanese cities. As U.S. planners prepared for the amphibious assault codenamed Operation Detachment, the airspace between Tokyo and Iwo Jima became a critical lifeline for Allied bombers and a carefully laid hunting ground for the Japanese military, determined to defend their homeland at all costs. On February 16, 1945, 36 B-29 superfortresses from the U.S. 21st Bomber Command rumbled down the runways of Tinian Island Airfield in the Mariana Islands, their massive 4 engines shaking the ground as they lifted off into the pre-dawn sky. Their target, a sprawling Japanese aircraft factory on the outskirts of Tokyo, a key producer of fighter planes and components that kept Japan's Air Force operational. The entire round-trip route spanned over 1,500 miles, a grueling journey that pushed both aircraft and crews to their physical limits. But its most perilous stretch lay just 100 miles from Iwo Jima, a narrow corridor of airspace perched precariously on the edge of U.S. carrier-based fighter escort range, trapped between Japan's formidable home air defense network to the north and the heavily fortified Japanese positions on Iwo Jima to the south. The Japanese military had spared no expense in fortifying Iwo Jima. They had installed over 200 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from small-caliber machine guns to massive 120mm cannons, strategically positioned on the island's volcanic cliffs and ridges, creating a deadly crossfire that could tear apart incoming aircraft. They had also stationed more than 40 Mitsubishi AM-0 fighters on the island's 2 airfields, aircraft known for their agility and speed, which made them deadly adversaries in dogfights. To make matters worse, Japanese radar operators on Iwo Jima could detect Allied aircraft up to 40 miles away, giving Zero pilots ample time to scramble, form hunting formations, and position themselves for ambush. For the cumbersome, slow-moving B-29s, each weighing over 60 tons, fully loaded, with a wingspan of 141 feet. This stretch of airspace was a veritable death corridor. Once separated from their formation, they became easy prey for the nimble Zero fighters, which could dart in and out of attack positions, picking off vulnerable bombers one by one. Compounding the danger was the inherent limitation of the P-51 Mustang, the primary escort fighter for B-29 missions at the time. While the P-51 had a far greater range than its predecessor, the P-47 Thunderbolt, thanks to its external fuel tanks, it still struggled to cover the entire distance of the Tokyo bombing runs from Tinian Island. Per operational plans, P-51s could only linger over the target area for 15 minutes before needing to turn back and head for home. Any delay would result in running out of fuel mid-flight, forcing pilots to ditch their aircraft in the open ocean or parachute into enemy-controlled territory. This in-and-out escort model left B-29s vulnerable for most of their round-trip journey, especially during the critical phase when they were leaving Japanese airspace and the escorts were low on fuel. The Japanese military had studied this pattern closely and exploited it ruthlessly, launching their most devastating attacks precisely after U.S. escort fighters had departed. It was for this reason that U.S. pilots began referring to the airspace near Iwo Jima as the final hunting ground, a place where survival was never guaranteed, and where every mission could be one's last. Adding to the peril was a critical miscalculation by U.S. intelligence. After 2 years of sustained bombing campaigns against Japanese military and industrial targets, Allied planners had assumed that Japan's air defense capabilities had been severely crippled. They believed that the Tokyo raid on February 16th would face minimal resistance, allowing the B-29s to complete their bombing run and return to base without incident. But this assumption couldn't have been more wrong. To defend their homeland from what they saw as an existential threat, the Japanese military had pulled out all the stops. They had Gyoji elite squadrons of kamikaze, pilots originally trained for suicide missions against Allied ships to act as fighter escorts, and they had modified hundreds of Zero fighters to serve as dedicated B-29 killers. These upgraded Zeros had their machine guns replaced with powerful 20mm cannons and were fitted with underwing rocket pods, drastically increasing their firepower. While these modifications slightly reduced the Zero's legendary maneuverability, they made it far more deadly against the heavily armored B-29s. Just 3 well-placed 20mm rounds could pierce the bomber's hull, damage critical systems, or ignite fuel tanks. Despite their size and Houzhong armor, B-29s were no match for swarms of these modified Zeros, which could attack from multiple angles, overwhelming the bomber's defensive machine guns. This fatal miscalculation by U.S. intelligence would pave the way for the brutal confrontation that awaited the Guardian and its crew. At 10:17 a.m. on February 16th, 25 miles from the Tokyo target, the 36 B-29s of the 21st Bomber Command formed up into their tight, box-like bombing formation, their wings almost touching as they prepared to release their payloads. Lieutenant John Clark, a 31-year-old pilot from Chicago with 12 combat missions under his belt, sat at the controls of the B-29 Guardian, tail number 44673, holding position on the left flank of the formation. Clark was a calm, methodical leader, known for his ability to stay focused under pressure, a trait that has saved his crew more than once. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat was First Lieutenant Robert King, a 28-year-old from Kansas who had joined Air Force after graduating from college, his eyes scanning the instrument panel as he monitored the four massive Wright-Frena's 3,350 engines. Behind them, in the cramped, noisy cabin of the bomber, the 9 other crew members went about their duties. Tail Gunner Sergeant William Jones, a grizzled veteran from Alabama with a scar across his cheek, kept a sharp eye on the rear of the aircraft through his machine gun turret. Bombardier Thomas Wright, a 24-year-old from Massachusetts, hunched over his bomb sight, calculating the exact moment to release the 500-pound high explosive bombs. Radio operator Edward Cole, a quiet 26-year-old from Pennsylvania, adjusted dials on his radio equipment, listening for instructions from the formation commander. And waist gunner James Bell, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa, gripped his Havdero caliber machine gun, his fingers hovering over the trigger as he scanned the sky for enemy fighters. For a moment, everything seemed calm. The hum of the engines, the steady drone of the wind outside the fuselage, the occasional crackle of radio communications, and the crew allowed themselves a brief moment of cautious optimism. But that calm was shattered in an instant.
本音频由魔音工坊 AI 生成。
Alert! Enemy formation at 6 o'clock. 8 bogies, closing fast. The urgent warning crackled over the radio from the formation's lead bomber, its voice sharp with alarm. Clark barely had time to glance up from the controls before he spotted them. 8 Japanese Zero fighters, their silver fuselages glinting in the sunlight, diving toward the formation from the direction of the sun. It was a classic Japanese tactic known as the sun attack, which used the glare of the sun to mask their approach, making it nearly impossible for Allied gunners to track them until it was too late. Clark's heart raced as he shouted over the intercom. All gunners, man your stations. Enemy inbound. Stay sharp. Sergeant William Jones, the tail gunner, reacted instantly. He swung his dual Halliburton machine guns towards the oncoming fighters, his eyes narrowing as he tracked their movement through the turret's sight. With a loud roar, the guns erupted, sending red tracers slicing through the sky like fiery needles, marking the path of the bullets. But the Japanese fighters were too fast, too agile. They weaved and darted through the tracer fire, closing in on the formation in a matter of seconds. 3 Zeros broke off from the main group, their sights locked on the Guardian, which was positioned on the vulnerable edge of the formation. The lead Zero pulled ahead of the others, its 20mm cannons firing in short, deadly bursts. 20mm rounds hailed down like rain, slamming into the B-29's left wing with a series of deafening crashes. Left wing hit. Engine 4 on fire, shouted First Lieutenant Robert King, his voice rising above the chaos as he stared in horror at the instrument panel. The temperature gauge for Engine 4 spiked to red, and thick black smoke began billowing from the wing, curling around the fuselage like a dark cloud. Clark felt the aircraft shudder violently beneath his hands, as if it were a living thing in pain. He pulled desperately on the control yoke, trying to steady the massive bomber. But with one engine lost, the B-29 lurched 12 degrees to the left, its nose dipping toward the ocean below. "Fire extinguisher on engine 4, now," Clark barked, and King slammed his hand down on the red lever labeled Engine A, Fire Extinguish. A burst of carbon dioxide rushed into the engine compartment, but the fire continued to rage. Fuel had been ignited, and the extinguisher could do little to stop it. Before Clark could regain full control of the aircraft, a second zero struck. This time, the Japanese pilot targeted the B-29's underbelly, where the hydraulic lines and fuel tanks were located. 20mm rounds tore through the thin aluminum hull, slicing through hydraulic lines like paper. The cockpit's hydraulic gauge plummeted to 0 in an instant, and Clark felt the control yoke go slack in his hands. Without hydraulics, the elevators, ailerons, and rudder were nearly unresponsive, leaving the bomber clumsy and difficult to maneuver. To make matters worse, a round had punctured one of the B-29's main fuel tanks, and aviation fuel began gushing from the wing's gaping wound, spraying across the fuselage in a fine mist. The mist ignited upon contact with the burning engine, creating a towering inferno that spread rapidly along the left wing, inching closer to the fuselage with each passing second. Hydraulics failed, elevators unresponsive. "We're losing control." King's voice cracked with despair, his eyes wide with fear as he stared at the spreading fire. "Guardian, break off immediately. Return to base independently. Repeat, break off and return to base." The formation commander's order came over the radio, cold and firm. Paru S. Combat Protocol. Severely damaged aircraft were required to separate from the formation to avoid endangering the entire mission. If a damaged bomber exploded mid-air or crashed into another aircraft, it could take dozens of lives with it. Clark hesitated for a split second, his eyes darting between the departing formation and his burning aircraft. He knew what breaking off meant. In this airspace, with no escorts, no support, and a crippled plane, flying alone was almost certainly a death sentence. But he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he pulled the Guardian away from the formation, watching as the other B-29s continued onward toward Tokyo, their wings growing smaller in the distance. The crew fell silent, the only sounds the roar of the remaining engines, the crackle of the fire, and the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the fuselage. Meanwhile, the accompanying P-51 escort formation had already turned back, their fuel tanks nearly empty after hours of flight. They had received orders to return to Tinian Island immediately, and there was no way they could stay behind to support a single damaged bomber. Clark flipped on the emergency radio frequency, his voice urgent as he called for help. "Mayday! Mayday! This is B-29 Guardian. Tail number 44, 673. Hydraulics out. 2 engines down, on fire. Request immediate assistance. Does anyone copy?" But the only response was static, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed through the cabin, a stark reminder of their isolation. Sensing their vulnerability, the 3 Japanese Zeros launched another assault, their sights now fixed on the Guardian's cockpit, determined to finish the job. "Tail gun jammed. I can't fire." Jones's cry sent a wave of dread through the cabin. The tail gun was the B-29's primary defense against rear attacks, and without it, the bomber was defenseless from behind. The lead Zero seized the opportunity, diving toward the rear of the aircraft, its cannons firing relentlessly. A round struck the central bomb bay, empty of ordnance, but filled with residual fuel and explosive fumes, triggering a small blast that shook the entire fuselage. The force of the explosion tore a 2-meter gash in the bomber's hull, and shrapnel flew through the cabin, narrowly missing several crew members. Worse yet, the explosion severed the aircraft's oxygen lines, and the oxygen gauge plummeted to 0. at 18,000 feet. The air was thin and cold, and without oxygen, the crew would quickly succumb to hypoxia, confusion, dizziness, loss of consciousness, and death. Put on oxygen masks. Now, everyone, get your masks on, Clark shouted, fumbling with his own mask as he fought to keep the aircraft stable. The crew scrambled to comply, their hands shaking as they secured the masks over their faces. But the masks only provided a limited supply of oxygen, enough for maybe 30 minutes, at most. As if things couldn't get worse, Engine 3, already damaged by shrapnel, sputtered and died, its propeller freezing mid-spin. Now the Guardian was down to just 2 engines, both on the right side of the fuselage, which only worsened the aircraft's leftward tilt. The bomber began a steep, uncontrollable descent, plummeting from 18,000 feet to 15,000 feet in a matter of minutes. The ground, or in this case, the ocean rushing closer and closer. "Captain, we have to bail out. We're not going to make it," King urged, his voice trembling as he stared at the spreading fire, which had now reached the edge of the cockpit. Below them lay the open ocean, but it was Japanese-controlled territory. Any crew member who survived the jump would almost certainly be captured by Japanese forces, and the fate of Allied prisoners of war in Japan was well known. Starvation, torture, forced labor, and death. Yet staying aboard the Guardian meant being burned alive, crushed in a crash, or blown apart by an explosion. It was a choice between 2 terrible fates. Clark scanned the cabin, his eyes meeting those of each crew member. Jones, the grizzled tail gunner, his jaw set in a firm line. Wright, the young bombardier, his face pale but determined. Cole, the quiet radio operator, his hands clasped tightly together. Bell, the waist gunner, his leg bleeding heavily from a shrapnel wound, but his eyes still sharp with focus. He thought of their families, their wives, their children, their parents, waiting for them back home, and he knew he couldn't give up without a fight. Just a little longer. Clark gritted his teeth, his hands white, knuckling the control yoke as he fought to pull the bomber out of its dive. "We stay with the plane as long as it's flying. There's still hope." In that moment of despair, when all